step into the future with the best possible health and safety administration that we can muster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise with pleasure to follow on from my colleague and to support the passage of this bill and the government. However, I must point, I guess, to some of the questions that need to be answered by the Minister and some of the issues that will arise as an outcome of the legislation. As my colleague Mr Little said, much of this Part 1 refers to the transitional provisions in setting up WorkSafe New Zealand. I have to say that I, on the weekend, had a discussion at the opening of the new expanded mines rescue building and base in just north of Greymouth. And this was a topic of conversation, and most people welcome the progress in this area. There's a couple of things in working through. Right up front, in Part 1 here, relevant health and safety legislation means Health and Safety Employment Act 1992, Machinery Act, and a couple of others, Electricity Act. Most of those pieces of legislation are quite old. And the question I have of the Minister, and I guess of officials, in that what we don't want to be doing in making what is substantive progress in the area of workplace health and safety, setting up WorkSafe New Zealand, is not be constrained by reference to legislation that in the Electricity Act goes back to 92, Gas Act, Health and Safety, as we know, 92. Health and safety was a flawed piece of legislation, absolutely. I'm not sure that the Electricity or the Gas Act are, but what I want to know is that in referencing back to those pieces of legislation, technology or wisdom have not surpassed key reference points in the legislation, and that WorkSafe New Zealand, as set up, can actually have some sound drivers, aside from the legislation we're passing here, but not referencing back to legislation that may be flawed. As I say, I think we have clearly established that the Health and Safety Employment Act 92 is seriously flawed when it comes to some areas of workplace safety. Officials might not agree. We would say in forestry, we would say in mining, there are big gaps, and we need WorkSafe New Zealand to get on and do a good job. Mr Speaker, I support the SOP amendments put up by my colleague. Tripartite approaches to workplace safety are essential. The sad result of the terrible Pike River tragedy was in part because there was not equal strength from employees when it came to raising issues, raising concerns in the area of the workplace and how it was operating, and we need to know that those people who put their lives on the line have fair representation right at the top level of policy development, of practice, and of I guess, inspection, ultimately, to ensure that this happens. I have to say that the government has made some changes. They've been welcomed through the mining industry, but all the functions here stated in clause 10 are well and good, but they mean nothing if the resources are not provided. And the government has not provided adequate resourcing for the current responsibilities of the new high hazards unit and the other areas of workplace health and safety inspection, particularly in mining. So while we may be comforting ourselves in the House here tonight that we are passing legislation or moving forward, setting up WorkSafe New Zealand, I can say categorically that the resources that the Minister and his colleagues have put in and put up so far are inadequate, totally inadequate. And I want to hear from the Minister, it's not in the legislation, but I want to hear a commitment to adequate resourcing that mean people are not compromised in their duties. Mr. Speaker, a sad submission to the Pike River Royal Commission was from a mine inspector who felt totally, Mr. Chairman, a mine inspector who I know personally, whose life has been shattered by this, but who I know felt compromised almost from the time he took on the job as a mine inspector. I think we all share some of the responsibility of that inadequate resourcing for him. But it is not good enough for us to pass legislation in the House upgrading standards, upgrading the systems, but not providing the resources. And that is a regular comment I hear from families of the Pike River, men who lost their lives, people who are monitoring progress in this area very closely, because they have a real commitment. Their husband or father has paid a huge price to learn the lessons that are delivering us the legislation in the House at the moment. And I hope, and I'm sure the Minister will rise and give us some assurances in this area. It is essential. I hope the government will also see the wisdom of supporting Andrew Little's SOP that does and will entrench a tripartite approach to health and safety, because no employer is on the job the whole time and can know the minute-by-minute risk and changing risk profile that occurs in an underground mine or in a quarry or in any underground situation. We've had an explosion in a tunnel in Auckland. So it's not just in underground mines. We have had tragedies, we've had workplace accidents where they shouldn't have occurred, and we are boosting and bolstering the functions of these people, their obligations, but I haven't yet seen the resourcing. And so on behalf of not only the West Coast, a region where much of the mining occurs, it's up at Huntly, it's people who work in places of higher risk than the offices that we normally sit in on a day-to-day basis and that most of the officials sit in. We can manage our risk, but until people go underground, and indeed there are people in the ministry, the new super ministry, MOBI, an organisation that has a huge range of responsibilities. There are people there who have responsibilities for mine safety who've never been underground. I find that strange, if not alarming, and I would hope that every single person involved in the development of these regulations and of these practices goes underground for a couple of hours. Because until you've been there, you can't appreciate what these men are working in every minute of their shift. And the lack of appreciation and the casual approach that was taken in 1992, that the employer will know and manage the risk, has shown to be totally inadequate. To be, in fact, in hindsight, to have been irresponsible. We have moved on. I acknowledge the government and its efforts to improve legislation, to make the changes as recommended. Not all the changes. We need the SOP from Mr Little to implement the changes recommended by the Royal Commission around tripartite representation. So if the government once again steps back from the wisdom of that long and agonising process for the families, but in my view a very sound process that delivered sound recommendations, if the government steps back from any of those, then it's got to have a pretty good reason. And I haven't heard one yet when it comes to the Minister's proposal to appoint all the people to work safe in New Zealand. So I'm sure the Minister will take the opportunity to explain why, But the people who have their lives on the line need to have some input into the health and safety regime under which they work. That's the least that can be expected from them, for them. So on that issue and the one of resourcing, Mr Chairman, I ask the Minister to respond.
I call Brendan Horan.
Thank you, Mr Chair, for the call. I'd like to take just a brief call on part one of the bill.